upon the imminent threat to the First Amendment, the beating heart of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of press. That's what this hearing should be about. What's going on at the FCC right now? We are relitigating an issue that the Supreme Court has already decided that, in fact, independent analysts have debunked, even as President Trump and Federal Communications Chairman Brendan Carr and other Trump officials wage a war on free speech that this country has not seen since the McCarthy era in the 1950s. Like during that Red Scare, if you're a voice of dissent in this country, you have a target on your back, and they let you know you have a target on your back if you speak up. Law firms, universities, protesters, news media, all have faced this administration's wrath for their political speech. These threats are real. They're scary, and they undermine our democracy. The president is threatening the free speech of the broadcasters in our country every time they dare to run some news story that questions their judgment as an administration. Yet we're wasting time here trying to distract the American people with old emails from the Biden administration while Chairman Carr turns the FCC into the Federal Censorship Commission, threatening free speech, censoring free speech in our country, allowing Donald Trump to continue with his direct attacks on the First Amendment in our country. This is an urgent crisis for our country. Our democracy is at risk when the First Amendment is being challenged so fundamentally by the president out of the White House and instructing his chairman of the Federal Communications Commission to revoke the licenses of anyone who dares run any program that runs contrary to his views. That's what we should be focusing upon right now. That is the threat to our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And to mix sports.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question to my colleague, just 5 seconds. Did you sign on to that letter asking the FCC to revoke the license of Sinclair Broadcasting in 2018?
I'll have to go and to review that, but from my perspective, what Trump is doing right now at a presidential level, ordering the FCC to act, is absolutely an imminent threat to our democracy.
Okay, and I also, mixing sports metaphors on your strikes, I'm going to throw the red flag because the federal district court, I know something about this, said that the Biden administration had engaged in the worst example of violation of the First Amendment in American history. That decision was upheld by the Fifth Circuit. The Supreme Court did not rule against it. It sent it down. It didn't rule on the merits. It sent it down for a standing issue. So, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first just like to start by making a very clear statement. Government censorship is wrong, full stop. Never should be tolerated. That should be no matter what side of the aisle that you're on. I think we can agree that the government takes adverse action against speech that it dislikes. That's bad for all Americans, and it's counter to the fundamental values that this country stands for. As ranking member of Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, I have reviewed thousands of pages of documents, including testimony from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency employees. And I'll say that I simply don't agree that CISA, the agency, has worked in a coordinated effort to censor American speech. And the Supreme Court has basically agreed with that finding. However, if there's evidence of wrongdoing on the part of anyone in previous administrations, I want to address it, and I'll work with folks on this panel to do that. Protecting free speech should not be a partisan issue. And that's why I'm disappointed that instead of having the FCC here today to discuss what are urgent and I believe a flagrant violation of America's First Amendment rights, as my colleague just mentioned before me, instead we're rehashing debunked claims regarding activities at CISA from 2018 to 2022. Since it was created in 2018, CISA has protected our nation against cyber criminals and foreign adversaries who are constantly seeking to breach critical networks and steal America's most sensitive personal information. And unfortunately today, we're hearing claims that have been debunked about the agency's mission and its vital work. The Supreme Court decision in Murphy versus Missouri found with regard to CISA, quote, the evidence does not support the conclusions that the relevant plaintiff made that CISA had violated the First Amendment rights. So it's a Supreme Court decision. None of the documents I've reviewed included instructions for the social media platforms to respond to CISA's questions on flagged content, nor did they attempt to cover up their interaction in some way with these companies. So it's concerning to me that the committee would choose to focus on a backward-looking claim at a time when today, currently, we're seeing unprecedented efforts to wield government power as a tool to suppress free speech and stifle legitimate criticism and legitimate political discourse. In recent months, the Trump administration has revoked media access, got to say it again, over news coverage that didn't flatter the president. Oh my gosh, horrible. You didn't flatter the president. You can't have media access. That's a high crime and misdemeanor, apparently. He also sued media outlets who publish content that the president doesn't agree with. And he has launched baseless investigations into the president's perceived political enemies. In one instance, the president's FCC chair, Brendan Carr, threatened to revoke the broadcast licenses of ABA affiliates over comments made by a comedian. Oh my gosh, horrible. Comedian comments, revoke that license. President didn't like the comedy. Let's be clear, these acts are unprecedented in American history. And they rightfully raise alarms, I think, for every American. Thousands of Michiganders have reached out to my office saying that we must hold the Trump administration accountable to ensure that these abuses of power are not left unchecked. And I certainly hope that the chairman of this committee and members of the committee will devote their efforts to examining these abuses that I mentioned, regardless of who commits them, because we must all stand up for First Amendment rights in the face of unprecedented overreach. And it's right to call out wherever we see it, no matter who is saying it, no matter what administration. But let's not ignore what we're seeing in front of us right now, constantly in the media. So, Mr. Kimmelman, a quick question. After threatening regulatory action against ABC affiliates, if it did not suspend Jimmy Kimmel, FCC Chair Brendan Carr said, quote, if you're going to have a license from the FCC, we expect you to broadly serve the public interest, end of quote. So my question for you, sir, is there precedent for the FCC using the public interest, convenience, and necessity standard in the Communications Act to stifle First Amendment protected speech? And how has the FCC historically interpreted the public interest? How is this different?
No, not to my knowledge, Senator. The FCC has used, it's a public interest standard. The FCC has used it very carefully. There's specific direction in the Communications Act beyond the Constitution itself of Congress reminding the FCC not to stifle speech, not to impede First Amendment rights. And the FCC has been very careful in that regard.
So the comments made by the current FCC chair is simply unprecedented in all of your knowledge of past actions.
In my experience, Senator, I've been doing this for more than 45 years. I have never seen anything like that.
That's perhaps why it was so shocking to Americans all over this country, but apparently not to some individuals serving in the U.S. Senate. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I begin, one of my colleagues raised a letter that was sent to the FCC back in 2018 that was signed by Democrats. I don't know how many of you know who the chair of the FCC was in 2018? Do any of you know? Does the name Ajit Pai sound familiar? Do you know who was president in 2018? Donald Trump. I'm sorry if I stumped you all. It was Chairman Pai that denied this thing. And Chairman Pai, in his order, he said something along the lines of, what was submitted to the FCC lacked candor. It's funny to me how there's so many legal ways to call a lie a lie. When the FCC says a submission lacks candor, it means that it intentionally provided false or misleading information, omitting crucial facts. just so that the record's straight. Mr. Volek, just a few weeks ago, the Federal Communication Commission Chairman Brendan Carr made several statements. You've heard a lot of them today, with regulatory action over remarks made by Jimmy Kimmel if they, quote, didn't take action. In his own words, Chairman Carr said, quote, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Now, to be clear, ABC can suspend Jimmy Kimmel's show for whatever reason they want. However, the fact pattern that led ABC to suspend Jimmy Kimmel's show involved a government official, in this case, FCC Chair Carr, making direct threats. As you have written, quote, "But if the government coerced ABC into suspending the show through threats or of retaliation, that would have likely violated the First Amendment." Yes or no, if ABC acted to remove Jimmy Kimmel because of FCC Chairman Carr's threats, would Carr's actions violate the First Amendment?
Yes, I think so.
Unfortunately, the events from a few weeks ago related to Kimmel's show is not the first time that Chairman Carr has weaponized the FCC against broadcasters since he took office. Mr. Kimmelman, I'd like for you to help get some facts on the record. I think you answered these to Chairman Markey, but questions sometimes need to be heard twice. And as the response is, did President Biden ever direct Chair Rosenworcel to investigate a media company, pull their license, and impose the maximum fines and punishment, by the way, that's a quote from Donald Trump, for their unlawful and illegal behavior immediately after threatening to sue that company?
No, Senator.
Did President Biden suggest Chair Rosenworcel should revoke broadcaster licenses for giving him, quote, bad publicity?
No, sir.
Did Chairman Carr reinstate complaints against NBC, ABC, and CBS for election coverage that were dismissed by the prior FCC?
Yes, Senator.
Did Chairman Carr launch investigations into local NPR, PBS stations alleging that they could be violating federal law by airing commercials?
Yes, Senator.
Has Chairman Carr openly threatened to remove Comcast broadcast license over news coverage?
Yes, Senator.
Now, look, what's disappointing is that's just a sample of what's recently happened. And I appreciate this hearing. I think this was a good hearing. There are a few of us that actually authored legislation to say, FCC, keep your hands off of these media companies. Protect the First Amendment. Follow the law. I hope that's something that you all will take a look at and see if maybe there's bipartisanship. And if anyone's worried about doing it under this president, let's say the next president. Let's just say, let's take this off the table. So I certainly hope that's something that we can all do together. Now, Mr. Kimmelman, President Trump has developed a habit of suing media companies if they report or publish content he doesn't like. He sued CNN, ABC, CBS, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I mean, it goes on and on. Trump even sued the Pulitzer Prize winner to the New York Times and Washington Post for their reporting about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Now, some of the media companies such as ABC and CBS chose to settle. Others are still fighting. Even if a lawsuit is baseless, what effect does it have on the opposing party, Mr. Kimmelman?
Senator, it has an enormous chilling effect, even as you've heard from my colleagues on this panel here in a different context. It's overwhelming to take on the government. Even if you think you can vindicate your rights, it's daunting task, and it tends to pull people away from presenting the views, are actually trying to vindicate their rights because it is such an overwhelmingly costly endeavor.
Look, I think it's fact that Meta paid $22 million to President Trump to settle a lawsuit. Did Paramount pay? Yes, $16 million to President Trump as well. After Skydance settled, there was a merger approved within days as well. As a matter of fact, my team looked into the last time that a president sued one of these media companies. They had to go back to Teddy Roosevelt to find it. And do you know how much the settlement was for? 6 cents. Anyhow, there's a little trivia for you all as well. Look, as my time concludes, Mr. Davis, I don't know if you've ever been asked this. I can't find anywhere on the record where you've answered it. Who won the 2024 election in the United States of America?
Who won the 2024 election?
Yeah, for president.
Joe Biden was elected president.
In 2024?
Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Had 2020
That was
brain.
misinformation right there. So let's set the record straight. Who won the 2024 election?
I was in government censorship mode. Donald Trump won the 2024 election.
Who won the 2020 election?
Joe Biden was elected president in 2020.
I appreciate that very much. Right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Well, since we're doing some presidential history, Mr. Davis, could you name the last president that was a prosecutor attempted to throw in jail for the rest of his life and impoverish his family? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, I recall Donald Trump being threatened.
Right, they're the
with
only one, not
prison.
even Teddy Roosevelt, since we're going back in time. I do want to ask you, Mr. Kimmelman, because just as a follow-up for it, and I'm going to get to you just very quickly. The question was a president suing a news organization, and you said that the government taking that on would have a chilling effect. You're not arguing that an individual citizen, as President Trump, suing a media company for lies is a threat to the First Amendment, right?
No,
Okay,
no.
thank you. Senator Blunt, Rochester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleagues, yesterday there was a split screen on the news. Coverage of committee hearings and a shutdown clock. It was a tale of two realities. Republicans continue to call for hearings like it's business as usual, while Americans are literally living in the midst of a shutdown that jeopardizes their health, that jeopardizes their jobs, and the services that Americans rely on. So the issues before us are vitally important, but our number one priority in this moment should be reopening the government and restoring people's health care. So today I want to use my time to remind all of us what is at stake. We're in a pivotal moment. Energy costs are up. Food prices are up. The rent has gone up for many. And millions of Americans in red states and blue states alike are on the brink of their healthcare costs doubling or losing it altogether. From small businesses to farmers to ranchers to moms and dads, at this very moment, Americans across our nation are making some very difficult decisions about how to make ends meet. We can fix this, but it requires negotiations. It requires us all to do our jobs and to find a path forward together. We can reopen the government. We can restore healthcare for the millions of Americans who are counting on us. But it requires urgency, and it requires trust, and it requires willingness to come to the table now. My Republican colleagues control the White House, the House, and the Senate. The ball is in your court. Let's make a deal. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I want to ask just a couple of questions before we close out here, because this is a topic of great interest to me. Mr. Davis, obviously this agenda that was at work cost you a lot, critical resources for your publication, your family. Given organizations like, I mean, there's so many of these that we just do not have time to go into them. I mean, the truth of the matter is what was uncovered was that, you know, we took their deposition. The CDC had approved words and phrases that social media companies could use in this secret portal that was established between the government and these social media companies conveyed this. And if people utter this phrase, I mean, this is sort of like, this is prior restraint. So like, this is what you will take down ahead of time. CISA was very much involved in this. You have an alphabet soup of agencies most people have never heard of that were weaponized against millions of voices in this country. We talk about President Trump a lot, but there's just a lot of just people who were online who had questions about forced masking of kids or the vaccine mandate, all those sorts of things, and they were throttled or taken down. So given what you know about organizations like the Election Integrity Project, that's another one, in collaboration with CISA and receive taxpayer funding, how are these NGOs still working currently to harm individuals from speaking their mind, particularly conservatives?
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing about these censorship tools and technologies and efforts is they're a little bit like injecting something into the body's bloodstream. They inject it in, it's in there, it's working its thing. And just because you pull the needle out doesn't mean the effects are gone. A lot of these organizations are still out there using technologies and tools that were deliberately funded and distributed by the federal government for the purpose of censoring people like me, people like Alex Berenson, people like my colleague Molly Hemingway. I don't know if we will ever actually be free of the effects of this censorship industrial complex that the previous administration created. I don't know if we will ever be free of the horrible effect that it created, the horrible dampening and abridgment of our speech that we were forced to endure secretly for years, and the extent of which we still don't fully know.
Mr. Berenson, I want to ask you, what is the most, in your kind of review of all this stuff after the fact, what's the single, I mean, it's hard to probably pick one. What's the most shocking thing that sort of you uncovered or found out about this whole thing, your experience?
That the White House would directly target me as an individual. You know, and again, RFK. Again, I think the White House, the federal government has tremendous power. It's more than it should go out there and say what it thinks. And if it wants to promote mass or whatever it wants to promote, obviously it has every right to do that. But to target individuals or target entire classes of speech, I just don't understand how anybody thought that was okay. And clearly, I'll tell you actually what the most stunning thing was. The companies didn't like it. Okay. You had private companies saying, hey, we're worried about the First Amendment. You had a British politician, the former deputy prime minister of Britain, saying to the White House, I think there's a problem here. And the White House said, oh, no, don't worry about it.
And then lastly, then I'll get to Senator Hickenlooper. Mr. Volak, I want to ask you, the NIST AI risk management framework guidance advises developers, this is a government agency, advises developers to mitigate risks related to, quote, harmful bias and content that may not, quote, distinguish fact from opinion or fiction. From a First Amendment perspective, what is the danger of the government suggesting that these AI companies or other platforms should filter out, quote unquote, harm or quote unquote bias?
Well, if the government, if the government were to mandate that AI companies restrict their outputs in particular ways, I think that would violate the First Amendment, partly because of the rights of the companies, but partly because of the rights of users. Users as listeners, users as people who would want to use the AI to create their own speech. At the same time, when it comes to government procurement decisions, government needs to get AI for its own purposes. It has to insist that the AIs provide accurate information.
You understand the danger of that, though,
There's
right?
definitely
Yeah.
a danger, but at the same time, again, the government as buyer, the purpose of AI is to provide accurate information. Social media, I think the main purpose is to provide information that users supply. It's to provide, I think, should be a largely unfiltered channel.
A pass-through platform, which is why they're given the Section 230 protections in the first place, correct?
Well, I do think that is a good model as a pass-through platform, but AI cannot be to be effective at pass-through platform. It has to make decisions that we hope are decisions in favor of more accurate information. Otherwise, the government as user of AI will be constantly deceived by it. So I think in this procurement capacity, the government needs to be able to insist that the AI companies do what it takes to provide more accurate information and to fight, indeed, misinformation in their own output. That is something that is required. And indeed, AI companies don't have Section 230 immunity in that
Correct.
kind of context.
And I suppose I think this is going to be a big issue, whether you call it woke AI, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The previous administration, one of the untold stories to lock in, and I actually agree with Mr. Kimmelman on this point, to lock in the incumbents and the monopolies in exchange for that was to have algorithms that locked in this bias. And that is a very, very dangerous road to go down. So I don't think this is the last we're going to be. It's not really the purpose of this hearing, but since we're having the discussion, I think is really kind of an interesting and important thing. So Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree completely that what we should be looking at is the algorithms as much as the speech, because those algorithms are going to control what we get. And in a funny way, that's an abrasive and intrusive form of speech that has almost nothing to do with your freedoms. Let me just start just by saying that the First Amendment to most of us is a bedrock of our country, it's a bedrock of a healthy democracy. It protects people from government censorship at every level. It provides free speech, but it's not unlimited. And we know that speech that encourages violence, spreads lies from foreign enemies or defrauds people, fire in a crowded theater, that's not protected. But this freedom should be nonpartisan. whether you're Republicans or Democrats are in power, we should all remain united in stopping these genuine threats to the fundamental civil rights of our society. People in this country should be free to speak their minds without pressure, without censorship, not from government agencies or policies, not from companies acting under political influence. What worries me is that some claim to defend free speech only when it helps their political party and ignore it when it silences others. And I think it's worth reiterating that we're not here to pick sides. Is to make sure that we protect everyone's right to speak freely, no matter who they are, what they believe, or what they are saying. Let me start just by talking a little bit about campus. I went to a small liberal arts college in Middletown, Connecticut, the famous Wesleyan University. And they, like every school, had to navigate a lot of this in the last couple years. We've seen an increase in people calling for imposing bans on peaceful organizing related to issues such as the war in Gaza or Black Lives Matter. I think we also need to recognize our duty to protect the rights of conservative views that are expressed on college campuses. I know the Wesleyans worked very hard to make sure that they get both sides, but not everyone has. And whether we agree or disagree with each other, our right to that freedom of speech should be defended loudly and consistently. I think as long as we all feel that our safety is protected from threats of violence, unconscionable violence. So let me start, Mr. Berenson. Regardless of ideology, as long as individuals or groups are not inciting violence with the intent to harm others, should they not have the same rights to free speech?
Yes.
Not a very complicated question, but it's one of those ones that I feel like the more times you can ask it on the record, each time you do that, it builds a little bit of a better foundation. Mr. Davis, you've defended conservative speech online. Would you extend that same defense to college students expressing their views about the U.S. foreign policy or calling for racial justice if their speech was censored by a state government?
Yeah, I don't think American citizens should be subjected to censorship by their government anywhere for any reason.
Just want to make sure that's on the record. I was pretty sure what that answer would be. We've seen some disinformation campaigns from foreign governments. U.S. government under both Republicans and Democrats have worked hard to limit counter foreign propaganda. They're especially important. These efforts are especially important when it comes to stopping these disinformation campaigns that oftentimes are trying to interfere in our elections. Under the first Trump administration, the FCC even proposed to require the mandatory disclosure of all foreign-sponsored content broadcast over TV or radio. Again, there are some that argue that that disclosure would, in fact, be a form of limitation. I'm not saying that myself. Now, Mr. Berenson, again, would you support the government having zero communication with companies about foreign disinformation campaigns that could affect U.S. elections or public safety?
I mean, I haven't really thought about that. Zero, I don't know, there might be a time when it would be reasonable, but I mean, you said foreign, right? I mean,
Yes.
So the First Amendment is not implicated. The problem, as we've seen in the last 10 years, it's very easy to go down a slippery slope and you start interfering in American speech. So I think you have to be very careful.
That's where that question comes from, especially when sometimes that disinformation is our foreign rivals or adversaries, Iran, Russia, China. Last question, Mr. Volokh. Isn't there a difference between coercive threats and agencies actually sharing factual information about foreign disinformation campaigns? And I think one example of this would be Russia's 2016 interference efforts. And would you recommend the U.S. government simply stop investigating foreign interference on our elections altogether? Or, if we were to do that, what would that do? Would that help or harm our democracy?
So there is a difference between coercion and kind of other non-coercive communication. The coercion would be a First Amendment violation. The others may or may not be. depending, I think, on how systemic they are. I do think that indeed we've seen lots of situations throughout American history where attempts to try to suppress foreign influence have turned into attempts to suppress domestic dissent, including in the examples you gave of some people who are trying to suppress, I think wrongly trying to suppress anti-Israel speech on campuses, are arguing, oh, these people are the cat's paws of Hamas and such. So I do think that even to the extent it's permissible for the government to communicate with the platforms, I think it's important that there be as much transparency as is possible, consistently with national security, and that it's especially dangerous when when the government is trying to do that, and then nobody finds out about it for years or until somebody manages to break the logjam in a lawsuit using discovery.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I can ask one more question, I'll just be a yes, no, because this is one that I never really followed. I had until I was partners with a woman, remarkable woman named Joyce Meskis. I had a bookstore in Denver called The Tattered Cover. And she was a great defender of this, of free speech. And she looked at it in that sense of your speech is part of what you read. And you should be able to read whatever you want without government interference or knowing about it. And there was a domestic terrorist who had had a bomb. They were pretty sure that he had purchased the book on how to make this bomb at her bookstore. And she refused to give the information over what her customers had purchased. And I just wanted to see with each of you whether you think that's, in that situation, whether that's appropriate or not. And it's pretty much what it was. They wanted to find out whether this guy had bought that book from the bookstore as part of the case. And she said, you don't need that case. You got him on a million other things. This is a freedom of information issue. Yeah, start with you, Mr. Volokh.
Yeah, so as I recall, I think she prevailed in that particular case. I'm not sure that the court got it right there. As a general matter, especially if there's probable cause in a warrant, all sorts of information may need to be turned over, and I'm not sure there should be a categorical prohibition on disclosure of that information, especially when there's probable cause in a warrant.
I think that's a very smart answer, and I will just go with it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the facts of that case, obviously, as you are. I think that's a pretty complicated one, so I'm going to have to decline on that one because I just don't have enough information. But that's a tricky one.
You guys wouldn't make very good senators. You know, all of our cases are pretty tricky.
Senator, I can understand the sentiment that she expressed and why she did it. I think I agree with Mr. Volokh. If there's a real legal cause, that information be handed over, government has a right to it.
Well, I guess
I think they dodged pretty well, Senator. They'd make good senators.
You're exactly right. They would be excellent material for
Yes,
senators.
they pivoted.
I think that the Supreme Court obviously did support her, and that this was part of the free speech that should be protected. And I guess most of you disagreed with that, so you can feel some comfort that precedence doesn't seem to be that all powerful in the present court. So there's certainly a chance in a similar situation we might get a different ruling.
Thank you.
I
Thank you,
yield back.
Senator. Thank you all. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony here today. Senators will have until the close of business on October 15th to submit questions for the record. The witnesses will have until the close of business on October 29th to respond to those questions. And with that, it concludes today's hearing. The committee stands adjourned.